this episode of CLO Simplified, we will talk about 5 different ways in which CLO managers seek distressed asset flexibility today. Some of these concepts were already in CLO 2.0, whereas a couple are more recent, for example, loss mitigation obligations and bankruptcy exchanges, which we will cover in greater detail shortly. For those interested in a particular section, please feel free to forward to the relevant timestamps above. To start with a little background and to answer the question, why? One of the lessons that we learned from the last financial crisis was a lack of clarity in CLO docs on what managers could or could not do following the default and restructuring of a distressed asset. Hence, the first reason is to increase the transparency of CLO docs and to introduce clearer guidelines for managers. Secondly, to enable the manager to follow the credit. Some assets that got restructured could not be part of the pool or be invested in, as they would fail the eligibility requirement to be not defaulted or credit risk. Hence, the manager could not hold the asset and may be forced to sell it. And finally, to maximize recovery. Historically, distressed funds have been able to take advantage of such limitations to force restructuring that CLOs could not participate in and divert recovery proceeds from CLOs as senior lenders. Hence, one aim is to allow managers the ability to partially offset some of these limitations, mitigate such predatory practices, and to improve the recovery during the restructuring process. So, what are the 5 different ways in which CLO docs offer distressed asset flexibility? We often get questions from investors on the differences between these terms, so here is a brief overview. 3 concepts that already exist in CLO 2.0. First, restructured obligations. This allows manager the ability to acquire or to hold an asset following the restructure of an existing obligation held by the issuer, so long as it meets a shorter version of the eligibility criteria. What qualifies as a restructured obligation differs across transactions and depends on the scope of the eligibility criteria carve-outs, which is typically limited to not defaulted, the minimum rating requirement, etc. One other difference is on the treatment of long-dated assets, whether permissible and if so, the allowable bucket. Second, distressed exchange obligations. This allows the manager the ability to carve out from defaulted obligation definition and to treat the new obligation as a performing asset following an exchange offer, provided that it meets certain conditions such as the restructured obligation criteria, is a debt-for-debt exchange, is senior or pari passu, and current on interest and principal. Third, corporate rescue loans. This gives the manager the ability to purchase the European equivalent of a DIP loan, which is a super senior loan issued by a defaulted obligor. One key difference from US DIP. In Europe, we do not have Chapter 11, and corporate rescue loans do not benefit from the protection of the Bankruptcy Code. Hence, we typically see a 5% limitation in European CLOs. Corporate rescue loans are positive for 2 reasons. Firstly, they are in itself generally good investments with high return and recoveries. Secondly, they also allow the issuer to improve its recovery prospects on existing obligors. 2 more recent concepts: workout obligation, or otherwise known as loss mitigation obligations. This allows the issuer the ability to inject new money in obligations that's issued by a defaulted or distressed obligor with the aim to improve recovery. The aim is similar to that of corporate rescue loan, except that firstly, the scope of assets that can be purchased are broader, and secondly, there is no requirement to meet the eligibility or reinvestment criteria. Finally, bankruptcy exchange. This allows the manager the ability to swap a defaulted obligation for another defaulted or credit impaired obligation with the key aim to achieving a better recovery. In the next couple of minutes, we will focus on these 2 concepts. loss mitigation obligations or LMOs. The language around LMOs varies across transactions and can be complicated. Here is an overview of some broad questions we ask ourselves and hopefully useful to you. Firstly, how is LMO defined? Some transactions limit to only debt, whilst others also allow the purchase of equity or warrants. Otherwise, it generally refers to the purchase of an asset in connection with the workout or restructuring of an obligation already held by the issuer with the intention to enhance recoveries or minimize losses. Next, can the LMO be a revolving or delayed draw obligation? This exposes the issuer to the risk of potentially unfunded liabilities, hence is either not allowed or pre-funded at the time of acquisition. Whilst LMOs can be positive for transactions by improving recoveries, they are not subject to eligibility criteria and potentially exposes CLOs to an increased risk of par erosion. Hence, we look closely to how LMOs are funded, what credit is given to such assets, and how the proceeds from such assets are treated. Now, let's take a look at the typical conditions in the next slide. Firstly, on the funding of LMOs. There are variations across transactions, so this is a simplified illustration of what we typically see in European deals. There is generally no concern if LMOs are funded by amounts in the supplemental reserve or collateral enhancement obligation account, as these are typically excess proceeds that have been replenished junior in the interest waterfall. On the use of interest, we look for comfort that the use of such interest would not result in interest deferral in the next payment date, although most European CLOs also have the requirement of passing coverage tests immediately after such purchase or in the next payment date. Typically, the funding of LMOs are limited to excess par that the manager has built. Hence, only the excess of collateral balance over the reinvestment target par balance can be used to purchase LMOs. If managers can purchase LMOs within RTPB, we generally see additional conditions, for example, limited to assets that are senior in pari passu and meet most of the eligibility criteria, passing coverage tests, and all proceeds going to principal. LMOs do not have to meet eligibility criteria, so whilst managers can buy them, they typically receive no principal or OC credit, although it can be given defaulted obligation credit in cases where it meets most of the eligibility criteria. To limit the risk of par erosion, we look at how the proceeds from LMOs are treated. If no credit has been given to assets and was not funded by principal, the proceeds go to the interest or the supplemental reserve account, and where funded by principal, typically to the principal account. To the extent that credit has been given to LMOs, to prevent OC volatility, we generally see at least the OC credit first go back to principal, even if it is not principal funded with only the excess designated as interest. When does an LMO then get reclassified as a collateral debt obligation then? Typically, we see that happening when all the eligibility criteria is met for the asset, in which case the asset will get par credit. In some European transactions, the reclassification of LMOs involves a transfer of funds from principal to interest. In this case, we would generally see additional conditions such as the requirement to meet the reinvestment criteria, comfort that assets will receive the same haircut as per acquisition, and mitigants on potential conflicts of interest. Now, Bankruptcy Exchange. This allows the manager the ability to swap a defaulted obligation for another with the aim of getting a better recovery. Some deals also allow the exchange of a default for credit risk asset. Recently, we have seen proposals to extend the flexibility to credit risk obligations more generally. Whilst we do not expect a swap of a performing for a defaulted asset, it is also worth noting that such exchanges circumvent the typical reinvestment criteria. Hence, where it is an exchange between performing credit risk obligations, we have also looked out for additional conditions. Here we show the typical conditions we see in European deals. There can be variations, but the key is an expectation of better recovery, with the received obligation being senior or pari passu to the exchanged obligation. Generally, such exchanges are limited to a small percentage, with any additional payments limited to customary transfer costs. Otherwise, we look closely at how such exchanges are funded and if limited to excess interest or external contributions. When the received obligation is a performing credit risk obligation, we consider if the OC haircuts, such as discount obligation haircut, would be applicable as per a normal purchase. We've mentioned that an exchange of credit risk for defaulted is not permitted by CLO docs. Where an exchange between credit risk assets is allowed, we typically see in European CLOs a requirement for the reinvestment criteria to be met, for example, the coverage test and par maintenance conditions. In addition, to ensure the maintenance of credit quality, we generally see a requirement for the new asset to have the same or lower maturity and same or better rating. The language on distressed asset flexibility is varied, full of nuances, and continues to evolve. Hence, it is not possible to highlight all the differences in the time we have today. We have, however, tried to highlight our key observations and considerations from our experience with European CLOs. If you would like to discuss more, please reach out to myself or anyone else in the structured credit team. Thank you and have a good day.